At 63 years old, Melissa Sue Anderson is finally ready to talk, and what she has to say about her years on Little House on the Prairie is going to completely change how millions of people understand one of the most beloved television series in American history. Because for decades, while co-stars shared their recollections and fans held on to the warm, wholesome image of Walnut Grove and the Ingalls family, Melissa Sue Anderson stayed quiet. She watched. She listened. She carried what she knew in private, and now, at a point in her life where the weight of that silence has become heavier than the risk of speaking, she is choosing to tell the full story. And the full story is significantly more complex, significantly more human, and significantly more difficult than anything the audience sitting in front of their television sets every week ever could have imagined, while watching Mary Ingalls navigate blindness, grief, and loss with that signature quiet grace that made her one of the most memorable characters in the history of American television drama. To understand what Melissa Sue Anderson witnessed and experienced on that set, you have to understand who she was in the middle of, because the dynamic at the center of Little House on the Prairie's production was not a simple, harmonious, creative collaboration. It was a relationship between two extraordinarily strong personalities operating within a system that gave one of them significantly more power than the other, and that imbalance shaped everything that happened behind the camera in ways that the carefully maintained public image of the show was specifically designed to conceal. On one side was Michael Landon, a force of creative nature that anyone who has studied the production history of that show will recognize as both extraordinary and extraordinarily demanding. Landon was not just the star of the series. He was its architect, the writer, the director, the producer, the creative vision, the final word on virtually every significant decision made about how this show would look, feel, and communicate with its massive audience. His talent was real, documented, and undeniable. His ability to understand what moved audiences, to locate the emotional truth in a story and bring it to the screen, with the kind of authenticity that made viewers feel they were watching real family life rather than a television. Production was genuinely rare and genuinely remarkable, but that talent existed alongside a personality that demanded complete authority and complete compliance with his creative vision. Landon's intensity on set was not occasional or situational. It was constant, pervasive, and applied to everyone in his orbit regardless of age or position. When he had a vision for how a scene should feel, how an actor should deliver a line, how an emotional moment should be constructed and captured, he pursued that vision with a relentlessness that left very little room for alternatives. And for the adults in his cast, people with their own creative perspectives, their own professional experiences, their own sense of what the work required, that relentlessness was something they had to find ways to navigate carefully and strategically. For a child actor, it was something else entirely. And on the other side of that dynamic was Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, the matriarch of the family, the emotional anchor of the series, the character whose steadiness and warmth made the entire fictional world of Walnut Grove feel safe and real and worth caring about for millions of viewers. Karen Grassel brought something essential and irreplaceable to that show, a quality of genuine, grounded human warmth that no amount of production technique or directorial skill could manufacture without a specific kind of talent at its center. But Karen Grassel was not simply accepting the terms of her position quietly or gratefully. She was fighting consistently, persistently, and at considerable personal and professional cost for recognition, for fair compensation, for the kind of creative respect that her central role in the show's emotional success should have guaranteed her, but that the system around Michael Landon consistently failed to provide. The inequities she was battling were real, documented, and significant differences in pay, in creative authority, in the degree to which her contributions were acknowledged and valued by the people controlling the production. And those battles, the negotiations, the confrontations, the cold silences and the shifting atmospheres that followed moments of direct conflict were happening constantly on a set where a young girl named Melissa Sue Anderson was watching everything, absorbing everything, and learning things about how power operates in professional environments that most adults spend entire careers trying to understand. Melissa Sue Anderson arrived on that set as a child, genuinely, developmentally, emotionally a child, and was immediately placed in the middle of a creative environment that demanded things from her that most adults would find genuinely challenging. The storylines she was given were not the light, accessible, age-appropriate material of typical children's television. She was asked to portray blindness to embody the specific, devastating experience of a young woman losing her sight and having to reconstruct her entire relationship with the world around her. She was asked to portray grief, the loss of a sibling, the death of people she loved within the fiction she was inhabiting, emotional territory that requires a performer to access something genuinely raw and genuinely painful to render authentically. These were not performances that could be approached with the emotional distance of craft technique alone. These were performances that required Melissa Sue Anderson to go somewhere real, to feel something real, to bring the full weight of genuine human emotional experience to scenes that the audience needed to feel were true. And she was a child doing this, still navigating the basic developmental work of understanding who she was, what the world meant, how relationships function, and simultaneously being asked to portray the most extreme and devastating emotional experiences that human beings encounter. Every take was a full commitment. Every scene demanded authenticity. And when Michael Landon was directing those scenes, applying his relentless creative pressure, demanding that each moment hit the emotional mark he had envisioned. The weight on Melissa Sue Anderson was not the weight of a professional assignment she could clock out from at the end of the day. It was the weight of a childhood being shaped, fundamentally and permanently, by demands that exceeded what she was developmentally equipped to carry. And while all of that was happening on camera, while Melissa Sue Anderson was delivering heartbreaking performances that moved millions of viewers and helped define what American family television could aspire to be off camera, she was absorbing a different kind of education entirely. She was watching the relationship between Michael Landon and Karen Grassel. She was observing the specific textures of that dynamic, the moments of tension, the clipped conversations that carried more meaning than their words contained, the silent distances that opened between two people after a disagreement that neither fully resolved but both had to set aside in order to continue working together. She was young enough that she could not fully understand what she was witnessing, could not name the specific dynamics of power and authority and professional inequity that were playing out in front of her. But she was perceptive enough to feel the atmosphere change when those tensions surfaced. She was observant enough to notice when the warmth that the cameras captured was absent from the spaces between takes. She was developmentally sophisticated enough to understand, even without adult vocabulary for it, that the world she was working in operated according to rules that were not always the rules being taught to the audience at home. And the lesson that she absorbed from watching Karen Grassel fight for recognition and respect, from watching what happened to someone who spoke up, who pushed back, who refused to simply accept the inequitable terms being offered to her, was a lesson that shaped Melissa Sue Anderson's professional survival strategy for years. That lesson was that silence was frequently the most functional tool available to someone in a position of limited power within a system controlled by someone with significantly more of it. Karen Grassel's courage in confronting the inequities she faced deserves specific acknowledgement because what she was doing was genuinely difficult and genuinely costly. She was not simply complaining about conditions or expressing dissatisfaction through conventional channels. She was directly challenging one of the most powerful and most controlling creative forces in American television. A man whose vision had built the show that gave her professional visibility, whose authority extended across every aspect of its production, and whose reaction to being challenged was not gentle or accommodating. Grassel was fighting for her financial value to be recognized, for her compensation to reflect the actual contribution she was making to a show whose success was significantly dependent on the specific quality she brought to it. She was fighting for her creative voice to be heard, for her understanding of the character she was embodying to be respected and incorporated rather than simply overridden by Landon's singular vision. And she was fighting for the basic professional respect that any performer of her caliber, making her level of contribution, should have been able to take for granted. She did not always win those fights. The system she was fighting against was too well-resourced and too entrenched to simply yield to the pressure of one performer's justified demands. But she fought them consistently, visibly, and with a persistence that Melissa Sue Anderson watched with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. Admiration for the courage it took to confront power that directly, and apprehension about the personal and professional cost that confrontation carried. Melissa Sue Anderson learned from both of them, and what she learned from each was fundamentally different. From Michael Landon, she learned about creative vision, about what it looks like when someone has a genuine, deeply committed understanding of what they are trying to create and pursues it with a completeness that accepts no shortcuts and tolerates no approximations. Landon's dedication to the emotional truth of what he was making was real, and for a young actress developing her craft under his direction, that dedication was a genuine education in what serious artistic commitment looks like and demands. But from Landon, she also learned about the cost that a singular, controlling, creative vision imposes on everyone in its orbit, about the way that complete authority, even when wielded in service of genuine artistry, diminishes the humanity and the professional dignity of the people who must operate within it without the power to shape its terms. The pressure he applied to her as a child was real, and the understanding she developed through surviving that pressure about what professional environments can demand and what they should not be permitted to demand was something she carried forward for the rest of her career. From Karen Grassel, she learned about courage specifically, the kind of courage that requires sustained effort against persistent resistance, that does not produce immediate victory but that maintains its position regardless. Grassel's fights for recognition and compensation did not always result in the outcomes she deserved. But the fighting itself was a model, a demonstration that the terms being offered to you in a professional environment are not necessarily the terms you have to accept, and that the act of refusing inequitable terms has value and dignity regardless of whether the refusal produces the desired outcome. What Melissa Sue Anderson did not fully articulate to herself at the time, but what she now understands as a 3-year-old woman looking back at the formative experiences that shaped her, is that the silence she chose as her survival strategy was not simply passivity. It was a sophisticated, calculated response to an environment she had assessed accurately, and in which she had identified the tools most likely to protect her ability to continue working, continue growing as a performer, and continue navigating the competing pressures of Landon's authority and Grassel's advocacy without being destroyed by either. Silence, in the context of Little House on the Prairie's production environment, was a form of intelligence. It was the recognition that speaking without power to back the speaking produces consequences that silence avoids, and that the most effective form of self-preservation available to a child with talent but without authority was to observe carefully, perform excellently, maintain composure consistently, and wait for circumstances to shift into a configuration where the cost of speaking was something she could absorb. That waiting lasted decades. And the circumstances that finally shifted enough to make speaking feel possible are the ones that have brought Melissa Sue Anderson to this moment at 63, with the perspective that only decades of reflection and distance can provide, choosing to give the full account of what she witnessed and experienced to an audience that deserves the complete truth about a show they loved. The emotional labor involved in what she was asked to do as a child on that set cannot be overstated, and it deserves sustained attention rather than being reduced to a footnote in the larger story of the show's production. History. When a child actress is asked to portray blindness, the demand is not simply that she learn blocking accommodations that prevent her from appearing sighted on camera. The demand is that she inhabit the specific psychological and emotional reality of someone who has lost something irreplaceable, who has had to reconstruct her relationship with every dimension of her physical experience, who has had to find new ways of navigating the world that she had previously taken for granted. To do that authentically, to make it land for an audience in a way that produces genuine emotional response rather than recognition of skilled performance, requires accessing something real. It requires that the person doing it find the genuine emotional truth of loss and disorientation and grief and adaptation within herself and bring it forward into the performance. For an adult performer with a full emotional vocabulary and a developed understanding of loss, that is a significant challenge. For a child who has not yet had the life experiences that would provide the emotional reference points being accessed, it is something considerably more demanding and considerably more potentially destabilizing. And Michael Landon, for all his creative brilliance, was not primarily concerned with the developmental welfare of the children in his cast when he was constructing those emotional demands. He was concerned with the scene, with the emotional truth of the moment, with getting what the camera needed. The care he may have felt for his young co-stars was real, but it existed in a different category than the creative demands he applied to them without significant accommodation for the specific vulnerabilities of childhood. Now, speaking at 63, Melissa Sue Anderson is clear about the nature of what she is doing and what she is not doing. She is not here to scandalize. She is not attempting to destroy legacies or reduce complex people to their worst moments or most problematic behaviors. She understands, with the full perspective that decades of reflection provide, that Michael Landon was a genuinely extraordinary creative talent whose work touched and moved and genuinely mattered to millions of people, and that this truth coexists with the truth about the personal costs his creative methods imposed on the people who worked within his orbit. She understands that Karen Grassel was fighting real battles for real justice with real courage, and that the specific fights Grassel chose to engage in cost her professionally in ways that were neither fair nor proportionate to the legitimacy of the stands she was taking. She understands that the world she was working in as a child was a world that had not yet developed the frameworks, the language, or the institutional commitment to protecting young performers from the specific vulnerabilities that their age and their position within power structures created for them. What she is bringing now is not blame without context. It is humanity, the full, complex, difficult humanity of real people in a real working environment, trying to make something extraordinary under conditions that were frequently less than ideal and that carried real costs for real people that the show's carefully maintained public image was designed to obscure. For the millions of people who grew up watching Little House on the Prairie, and who carried genuine love for what it represented, the values it championed, the family it depicted, the world it offered as an alternative to the complexities of whatever was happening in viewers' own lives. Melissa Sue Anderson's account is not a desecration of something they treasured. It is an invitation to understand it more fully and more honestly. The show was real, art, genuine, meaningful, lasting art that connected with people's deepest values and deepest needs in ways that very few television productions achieve. That reality does not disappear because the conditions under which it was created were more complicated and more humanly difficult than the public image conveyed. If anything, understanding those complications makes the achievement more remarkable because it was produced by people navigating genuine tension and genuine inequity and genuine personal cost, and it still managed to be something beautiful and lasting and meaningful. Melissa Sue Anderson's voice adds the final dimension to a story that has been told in pieces for decades, from other cast members who shared portions of their experiences, from journalists and historians who documented what was publicly visible, from Karen Grassel herself, who has spoken about some of her professional battles. What Anderson adds is the perspective of the observer who was in the middle of all of it, young enough to be in the center of everything, perceptive enough to understand more than anyone realized she was understanding, and disciplined enough to hold what she knew until the moment was right to share it. That moment is now, and what she has to share is going to leave the legacy of Little House on the Prairie not diminished, but deepened, transformed from a nostalgic memory of wholesome simplicity into a genuinely human story of talent and pressure and courage and survival. and the extraordinary creative endurance required to make something beautiful out of conditions that were frequently anything but. The story of Little House on the Prairie, told completely for the first time, is a story about what art costs the people who make it, about what excellence demands, what authority does to creative environments, what courage looks like when it operates without guaranteed outcomes, and what resilience means for a child learning, without language for it, that the world she is working in requires more from her than childhood was designed to provide. Melissa Sue Anderson carried all of that for decades, quietly, observantly, professionally, with the composure that her childhood on that set taught her was the price of survival. And now, at 63, she is setting it down, not throwing it, not weaponizing it, just placing it carefully in front of an audience that has loved the work she was part of and that deserves, finally, the full account of what making that work actually looked like from the inside. That account is a gift to fans, to television historians, to anyone who has ever wondered what the reality behind beloved art actually feels like to the people who created it under conditions they were never free to fully describe. And it is the final piece of a story that has been waiting for decades for exactly this voice to complete it.